Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to configure OAuth 2.0 client credentials grant with Azure AD B2C. So before going into the configuration steps, I will use this diagram from the Microsoft website to explain how it works. So in order to configure the client credentials grant in Azure AD B2C, it is slightly different from the way you do in some other products, like for example, Cognito. So here you need to create two different apps, and one app will be called as the API app, which is named as app 2 here, and the app 2 will have certain scopes, and scopes are basically, you can think of like permissions. So for example, let's say you have a API to read a user, to update a user, so you can have two different scopes like read user, update user, and depending on the scopes you can either allow or deny those APIs. And the app one in this particular diagram is a web application. Sorry, it's not a web application, but it's kind of a client application, and it can be a backend app of a UI page. So let's say you have a UI app, which in turn calls some backend APIs, and then the backend APIs can then call some other APIs to get data to render those data in the UI. So in this case, the backend app is actually the app 1, and app 2 will authorize app 1, and once the authorization is done, then app 1 can actually call the token endpoints in Azure AD B2C to get the scopes that are configured for app 2, which is the API app. So it is slightly confusing, but at a very high level, right? What is a client credentials grant? It is basically like, let's say you have a client application which wants to call certain APIs. Then the client application has to get some tokens from the authorization server and then call the APIs using those tokens. And the API will then validate those tokens and then allow or deny access depending on certain attributes in the API. And one of the key claims in the API, which is used for authorization, is the scope. So let's actually get to the configuration screens. That will be more clear, and then you will understand how this token is written from Azure AD B2C and what kind of claims are present in those tokens. So I'm going to use my developer account. It's a free account. Like, you can create a developer account in portal.azure.com and then use that account for your POCs. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm already logged into my Azure AD B2C tenant. So let's go through the steps. And if you want to follow the steps, you can also search for Azure AD B2C OAuth 2.0 client credentials in Google, and you will find this page where it explains each step. But some of these steps are a bit confusing, so it will be very clear once I go through these steps in this video. So the very first thing that we need to do is register a API application in this tenant. So basically, what we are going to do in the first step is to register this app 2 and then add some scopes to this app 2. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to name that app 2 as API app because that will be easier to understand. But in that diagram, it's actually app 2. So let's name it as API app and register it. And the next step is we need to add certain scopes to this API app. So if you look at this diagram, it says scopes. So how you do that in this API app is basically go to app roles and then create an app role, and let's name it as read user, like whatever example I explained. like a read user and an update user. Let's go ahead with that same example. Select applications, and the scope name will be read.user and the scope description will be read user details. So click apply and then create one more role called write user. Again select applications, name it as write.user, and this will be used for update user details API. So I created a couple of roles here. If you go to the manifest file, you can actually see those app roles, whatever app roles I created. You can also manually modify this manifest file to create these roles as explained in this particular Microsoft documentation. But it is easier to do it through the UI screens, and that's why I did it through the UI screens. But you can actually go directly to this manifest screen, modify, add some roles and save it. So we are done with the setup of app 2. Now we need to create a client application and then provide authorization to these APIs for this client application. So let's go back to this screen and create a new client app. Again, register. And if you go back to this documentation, there is one minor change that we need to do in the manifest file in order to allow this client app to make token API endpoint calls for authorization code grant flow. So if you look at this particular step, right, it says locate the access token accepted version element and set the value to 2 for this client application configuration. So go to this client app, manifest file, search for that access token accepted version and change it to 2 and click save. So once that is done, now we need to provide access to this API for this client application. So how are we going to do that? Let's again go back to this client app and then go to this API permission and add a permission. Go to my APIs and you can see the API app that I added. Select both the scopes and add permissions. And we need to provide admin consent for these two scopes in order for these scopes to appear in the access token. So let's provide the admin consent. So we are done with the admin consent for these two scopes. And the next step is we need to actually create a client secret and then call the token endpoints to get the access token for this particular client application. But before that, I actually missed one step in the API app as per the documentation. So let's go back to the API app and select this expose an API and then add, and we need to provide an application ID URI. I missed that step. So if you go back to this documentation, so there is a step where it talks about expose API and set the application ID URI to a URL like this, something like this. So let's go back to that screen and copy the domain name from the settings screen. So copy this and remove this API : / and add https : / the domain name / the unique identifier which got generated automatically. So select and add. So now this application ID URI is configured. So now let's go back to that client application. So sometimes it doesn't show up, just refresh the entire screen and then it will show the new client app that I created. So go back to the client app and now we need to create a client secret in order to call this token endpoint, which is actually mentioned here in the documentation. So let's do one thing. Let's first construct this entire token endpoint with all the required parameters and then generate the client secret and then copy it to the uh, that request. So I'm going to use Postman here for constructing this token endpoint request and passing all these parameters to get the access token. So let's go ahead and copy this URL and put it here. And it needs to be a post endpoint. So if you look at this example here, it's actually a post endpoint. So change this to post, and we need to replace this tenant name. So go back to this Azure AD screen and go to settings and copy this section, the first part of the domain, which is the tenant name. So replace this tenant name here and replace the tenant name here as well. And then we need to replace this policy value. So let's go back to the B2C screen, and there is there is a different policy like user flows. So by default you will see one policy created for your tenant. So copy that policy name and replace this policy with that policy name. So these are all the values that you need to replace in the token endpoint URL from this documentation. Now we can add all these post parameters one by one and then generate the client secret and replace that as well. So the grant type is client credentials. Then the client ID will be the web apps client ID. So go back to that Azure AD B2C app registrations, client app, and copy this application client ID value, paste it here. Now we need a client secret. So let's generate one for this web app. Go back to this certificates and secrets, create a new client secret. You can give any name you want, any description you want, and click add and copy this value and put it here. And the last parameter is the scope. So here you need to give the API URL, the API URL that we configured in one of these steps, the application ID URL. So let's go back again to the app registrations and go to the API app and expose an API and copy this application ID URI. That's what the documentation says here. Copy the application ID URI, paste it here, slash dot default. So now when you hit this request, you get a response with access token, which is a JWT token, and then certain details like when this token will be valid, when this token will expire, all those details. You can compare this response with the response in this documentation. It is actually the same response. So whatever we configured is showing up here. So here you can see the resource. So this resource is actually the API. So in order to find that, go back to the API app, go to the API apps overview, and if you look at this application client ID, it starts with 2065, ends with FCDB. So you can see here it starts with 2065 and ends with FCDB. So what it means is this particular web application got an access token which is authorized to call the APIs that are configured in this API app. So that's what it means. So as per this diagram, the client app actually hit the token endpoint and it received an access token which can be used to invoke the APIs that are configured using the API app, which is basically app 2 in this diagram. So that's what this resource indicates. And you can copy this JWT token and go to this jwt.io website and you can paste this token. And you can see the scopes which I created, the write.user and read.user. And then the audience value for this access token is actually the API application. So again, what it means is this particular client application, app1, received an access token from Azure AD B2C authorization server, and that particular access token is authorized to call APIs that are configured in this web API, which is app2. So that's what this token actually means. Yeah, like in case you are wondering like what it actually means. So if you are building a API application, you can build a security layer on top of that API application to validate this access token and then validate the scopes. And based on the validations and if the scopes are present, like for example, if the client application is calling a read user API, it should have read.user scope. If the client application is calling update user API, then it should have a write.user scope. Otherwise, that API that you are building should reject the request if a particular scope is not present. So that's how you actually design that end-to-end flow. That week, like I will post a separate video on that on how to build a API app using all these access tokens. But this is the concept. Like this is how it works. So now let's make a slight change. So let's actually go to that web application, which is the sorry, not the web application, the client application. So if you remember, we added both the API permissions here, and we granted the admin consent for both the scopes by default. And that is the reason why you see both the scopes in this SCP claim. And when I pass actually the default API scope, I'm getting both these scopes. So now let's make a slight change just to see how it changes, how the token changes. So I will actually revoke the admin consent for write.user. Generally, it takes maybe few seconds or maybe a minute for this configuration change to take effect. So let's actually wait for like few seconds and then again hit this token endpoint and see how this JWT token changes, like what claim in the JWT token changes. So let's actually hit it and see if I'm getting a totally new token. So I got a new token, but let's see if the changes got reflected there. Yes. So if you see the SCP value, it has only read.user. You cannot see the write.user scope. That is because I revoked the admin consent for the write.user scope. So now what it means is if the client application is calling the API, let's say the update user API with this particular access token, then the API must reject this call saying the client application don't have permissions to update a user detail. The client application has permissions to only read user details but not to update. So, so if this is how the authorization actually needs to be built in your API application based on these tokens. So this is the end-to-end configuration. It is pretty straightforward, but there are few things that you need to take care here and there. And if you miss some of these steps, like for example, from my own experience, I forgot to configure the application ID URI in this particular format, and it didn't work. Like I used a totally different format for the application ID URI. That is, for example, when I go to the API app, expose an API. So I used a different format and not a URL kind of format for the application ID URI, and somehow I was not able to get the tokens. I was getting some error, and I couldn't figure out why I was getting that error. But once I changed it to a URL type of application ID URI, I got the tokens. And the other thing is, other mistakes that you might do is, for example, when you are constructing this token endpoint URL, make sure you are giving the right names, the tenant names, the policy names, everything is correct. If there are any mistakes, you will see, like for example, I made some silly mistake and I got some error like this. For example, yeah, I got an error like the resource you are looking for has been removed. So you cannot figure out what is really happening. Yeah, you know it's a 404, but the problem is it's pretty difficult to figure out. So just make sure you follow the documentation as well as the video, like whatever I have shown, right? You follow these two and you should be able to easily configure this client credentials OAuth 2.0 grant with Azure AD B2C. In case you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post your questions or comments in the YouTube video and I will be happy to respond. I hope you enjoyed the video. So please subscribe. Thank you for watching.